Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Ezekiel chapter 28, where we read of the King of Tyre. We're beginning in chapter 28 and verse 11. Now, earlier in this chapter, it talks about a judgment against the prince, or you could call him the leader of Tyre. A different Hebrew word is used here. But now we come to verse 11. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre. Now, king might be a leader, but that term denotes a higher level of power. And notice Ezekiel was to say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. We come to what is said about this. Notice we already read the last part of verse 12. You had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. And then he goes on to describe how you were in Eden, speaking to this king of Tyre, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Now, those words take us back to the story of Genesis chapters 2 and 3, where we see man who was put into a garden, and he was confronted by the serpent and tempted there. And you'll remember the story about how Eve listened to the serpent and took the forbidden fruit and then gave to the man who was with her. Well, here is speaking to the king of Tyre. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Now you think, wait a minute, Adam and Eve, they didn't have any covering. They were naked up until they tried to put fig leaves, and then God gave them coats of skin. So of what is this speaking? Verse 13 goes on, and it describes these stones: the ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold. And then it goes on to describe all of these. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. Now, there are 10 of these stones that are mentioned. I'm not going to try to find significance in each of the stones, but think about that number, 10. That's a number that takes us back to the Torah, to Genesis, where I have 10 generations that are described. These are the generations of the heaven and earth. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. And 10 times you see that phrase. And then you get to Exodus, and there's 10 plagues and 10 commandments and 10 items in the tabernacle. And that number of 10 comes up again and again. Notice these various stones, they were in you on the day that you were created. Now, it could have said the day that you were born, the day that you rose up, but it doesn't. It uses creation language. It's deliberately drawing analogies from back there in Genesis of the creation and of Eden, the garden of God. On the day that you were created, these stones, they were prepared. We continue in verse 14. You were the anointed cherub who covers. Now, a cherub, that's a description of an angel. And you remember that the Ark of the Covenant had statues of two cherubim. Cherubim is just plural for cherub. Two cherubim with their wings outstretched over the ark, representing, not that they represented God, but they represented an honor guard looking toward the middle, that empty space, that place where you don't see anything, and it points to the fact that God is invisible. You can't see him. Well, notice, here is this king of Tyre. You were not one of two, but you were the anointed cherub who covers. And God says, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. This sounds like something right out of Genesis chapter 3, and it's supposed to. Verse 15, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until, and notice everything up to this point has been describing this individual in such glowing, cosmic, angelic terms, until unrighteousness was found in you. And notice we go from the day that you were created, but then a bad thing happened. Then unrighteousness was found in you. The passage goes on, verse 16, by the abundance of your trade you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God. I have destroyed you, O covering cherub. Notice that reference again. Before it was you were the anointed cherub who covers. You're still called again, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 17, your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you. By the multitude of your iniquities, by the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. Therefore, I have brought fire from the midst of you. It has consumed you, and I have turned you to ashes on the earth in the eyes of all who see you. Now, the big question is who is this? Verse 19, all who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You've become terrified, and you will cease to be forever. Two primary lines of interpretation have been given. One, made popular by people like Origen and Tertullian and Augustine, pointed this passage. Those were early church fathers, and they said that is an early description of Satan. Now, the word Satan isn't mentioned in the passage, but there are things that remind us of him. There's an earlier reference to the prince/leader of Tyre, and all of a sudden I come to the King of Tyre, the real power of the throne, this individual here of whom we have been reading. He was in Eden. You say, well, how many people were in Eden? There was God, there was Adam and Eve, there was the serpent, and from a New Testament perspective, I think that we can say that Satan was there. Now, Satan is not mentioned by name back in the garden, but Jesus could talk about how that Satan was a liar from the beginning, and his hearers put that together. They knew what he was talking about. Notice on the day that he was created, we saw that referenced twice. And, if we're talking about a regular person, we talk about when they're born, when they grow up, when they come to be. And we don't usually use that created word. That's not used too many times of other things that are created outside of the Genesis account. And notice, so it's argued that Satan was one of those created beings. Not that he was born, not that he just, but that God created him. Not created him as evil, but created him, and then he fell. He is described as the anointed cherub who covers. And not a normal person wouldn't normally be described as a cherub. When you say the anointed cherub that covers, the anointed, we could remember we talk in the New Testament about the anointed one, the Messiah. I suppose if we wanted to stretch this a little bit, we could refer to this as the messianic cherub, the messianic cherub who covers. And that covering idea, remember, that's what the two cherubim on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, that's what they did. They were symbolically covering. And actually in Solomon's temple, there had been these two giant olive, they were statues of cherubim that were over the Ark of the Covenant. They were very big. Their wings almost filled the Holy of Holies. And they were doing the same thing. These anointed cherub who covered. Originally full of wisdom and beauty, but then you were cast down. And from our New Testament perspective, that certainly looks as though it is describing Satan. Now, there's another line of thought as we look at this. The passage actually describes, it says you were the king of Tyre. It doesn't describe him, doesn't use the term Satan. In fact, if I understand the chronology of the various books of the Bible correctly, in the order in which they were written, the term Satan to be used of the person that we know as Satan had not yet been used in the Old Testament. Think about the places where it is used. It is used in the book of First Chronicles, Well, First and Second Chronicles were written as a unit and not completed until after the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel is writing this during the Babylonian captivity, so First and Second Chronicles are written after Ezekiel. Likewise, Zechariah chapter 3 has a reference to Satan. And whenever you say Satan in the Old Testament, it's always the Satan, Ha-Satan. It's actually a title. And so, but that title is used there, and Zechariah is written after the Babylonian captivity. And the other place where he is seen is in the book of Job. Now, Job, we're not entirely sure when the book of Job, and remember, there's two issues there. There's when the book of Job took place, and I have no idea, no opinion on that, because we're not told. But also the question comes up, when was the book of Job written? And of course, it had to be written after it had already taken place, maybe a great deal of time afterwards. It has been noted that the book of Job has certain phrases and figures of speech that are common to Chaldean, and if that's true, and I don't know if it is or not, I've read that and I've heard that from experts, but I'm not an expert in that field. I don't know the first word of Chaldean. But if that's true, then again, that would point to a later time of being written for the book of Job. And so here he is described as the king of Tyre. Ezekiel, when earlier in chapter 21, verse 30, describes Israel as having been created, not born, but bara, created, used exactly the same Hebrew word here. And later on, when we get to chapter 31, we're going to see the king of Egypt described by Ezekiel as being one of the trees of the Garden of Eden. Now, that's not literal, that's a figure of speech. It's describing how the king of Eden was like that, sort of using Eden as a figure, as a type of the king of Egypt in Ezekiel's day. And that might help us to maybe take another look. Is this Satan? Or is this language which is going to remind us of certain things? And so we look and we see that the past king of Tyre, we're reminded that he had helped in the building of Solomon's temple, a place that represented Eden. When you went into Solomon's temple, and only the priests were allowed to go in, but the other people had descriptions of it, you would see a stylized tree, a lampstand in the shape of a tree with bulbs and flowers, and it would be shining because it had 7 lamps on it. A tree of light, representing a tree of life, and things to eat that were there. There was a table of showbread, and then an altar of incense. And if you looked up, you would see all of these patterns of things like cherubim, that were these ornaments that were painted and stylized upon the inside walls of the temple. And then beyond that, you had the veil, and past the veil, of course, was the Ark of the Covenant, where you had the statues of cherubim that covered. And so when you went to the temple, it was a picture of Eden, and the temple itself had seen the king of Tyre. Hiram, the king of Tyre, had actually provided the supplies for the construction of that temple. He had been involved, not from the inside out, but in preparing for and for providing the materials for the temple of God. And now, the king of Tyre, this is a long time after Hiram, he's dead and buried hundreds of years, but now we read the king of Tyre, who is likened to one of those cherubim that were seen in Eden, but now he, that is the king of Tyre, he is fallen. He, instead of helping the Israelites to build their temple, he's actually taking advantage of the Israelites as they've been taken into captivity. He's been saying, "Oh, good, I can get some cheap slaves. I can go and take advantage of them and rob from them and steal from them." And he is a fallen, and I say this in a figurative sense, a fallen cherub, a fallen mighty one. And so the question comes up, is this Satan? Well, the early church fathers said that they felt that they could see Satan there. And I understand that. I feel the tension of that. I feel that Ezekiel is using language that takes us back to Eden. Are we supposed to see a picture of Hiram? Of course, like I said, Hiram was dead and buried. Or the early rabbinical thought was to look at this and say, this is a picture of the king of Tyre as a human, Adam. Remember, the word Adam actually means mankind. His name, he was a man, but his name actually meant that. And they looked at this as seeing, yes, the king of Tyre, but the king of Tyre representing mankind who came out of the garden and who had such a glorious position and yet fell into sin and was removed from the garden. And likewise, in a similar way, this king is now being described as being removed. Now, to us, as we look at this passage and we ask Hiram, Satan, Adam, we can look at the one who not just provided the materials for the temple, but who came himself and said, destroy this temple, and I'll raise it up in 3 days. Speaking of the temple of his body. The one who is the second Adam, much better, because unlike the Adam that fell in the garden, he comes and he died in our place to overturn that which Adam brought about, to be the better Adam, and who defeated Satan upon the cross and did away with death, rose from the dead, and calls us now to come and believe and follow him.